networking and advocacy, engaging stakeholders as volunteerism advocates, registration of focal and foreign volunteer service organizations. When we say volunteer service organizations, these are the organizations who are using volunteers in their organization to achieve their organizational goals, as well as deploying volunteers. So according to RA 9418, this organization should register with our office or PNVISCA. Unfortunately, maraming hindi nagre-rehistro po sa atin pa. And of course, recognition and documentation of best practices. So as I mentioned, annually during the National Volunteer Month celebration, one of the highlights is the search or awarding ceremony for the search for outstanding volunteers. Okay, many of our teachers actually were recipient of the search for outstanding volunteers. Next slide, please, Ryan. So these are some of the programs. I think I mentioned already the Bayanihang Bayan program. So each agency supposed to be per the memorandum order should establish their Bayanihang Bayan. So I think what DepEd is saying is yung ating Brigada Eskwela, ito yung ating Bayanihang Bayan sa DepEd. Other organizations like DNR, meron din sila, and DSWD. Ito yung kulang sa atin because there are only a few agencies that are actually complying with the memorandum order. And a volunteer program in the public sector. Ito naman yung employees of the government volunteering. In NEDA, we just started what we call the Bayan NEDAhan. This is the volunteer program of NEDA and its attached agencies. So yung mga union ng PAPCOM, ng NEDA, PNVISCA, PSA, nagsama-sama to comprise itong Bayan NEDAhan. And then, of course, the International Volunteer Service. So the foreign volunteers in the Philippines coming in. This is where we often coordinate with Director Ballesteros because many of our international volunteer service organization, their focus is still in basic education, like Australian volunteers, Peace Corps, and other organizations. COICA also. So what we are seeing is we are happy that DepEd has established this office so that in terms of linkaging, partnering, this would be easier for us, as well as mas madeload pa kami in terms of monitoring our foreign volunteers. And Filipino volunteers overseas, there are two big organizations that are sending out Filipino volunteers abroad, the UN volunteers as well as the VSO. Ang goal sana natin, sana by the time that we are able to meet yung ating ambition 2040 that we become a middle income country, ay sana meron din tayong sariling platform to send Filipinos to volunteer. Pero syempre, bago noon ay tulungan muna natin yung ating mga kababayan. And the other is, of course, the importance of advocacy and communication. So volunteerism for development, communication, and advocacy, where we hope to engage stakeholders as volunteerism advocates. We conduct activities, some platforms to be able to disseminate the value of volunteerism. And of course, document good practices. So we have some publications. Of course, our website is also one medium for us to communicate good practices. But of course, these are the areas where we actually need the help of all agencies in promoting volunteerism. So our strategy is really to mainstream volunteerism in all the sectors. So kaya we are very glad that DepEd is really helping us mainstream volunteerism sa education sector. Thank you. Next slide. How many more minutes? Okay. So our volunteerism initiatives, this is of course anchored, or this is all in support to our vision as a nation, a prosperous middle class society where no one is poor, a healthy and resilient society, a smart and innovative society, and a high trust society. And thus, many of our priority volunteering efforts are really towards improving the quality of life or focusing on the marginalized sectors. Next slide, please. So our volunteerism efforts, or volunteerism, is really embedded in our updated Philippine Development Plan. So we are really very glad that NEDA is able to highlight volunteerism in our Philippine Development Plan. And this is under the pillar of malasakit, or enhancing the social fabric. So under ensure people-centered, clean and efficient governance, volunteerism is, of course, accepted also as a good governance initiative. And there's also one item there: promotion of volunteerism, Philippine culture and values. So volunteerism is one of the Filipino values that we would like to promote, so that hopefully, even as we progress, we still will not lose our bayanihan spirit. Next slide, please. So I just would like to discuss briefly what we are doing under our main program on local volunteer service. Next slide, please. Okay, so ito na po, na-mention na rin natin yung Bayanihang Bayan, which is to promote, the objective is to promote partnership between government and the private sector, and also to engage various sectors, especially the youth, professionals, senior citizens even, no? So baka pwedeng hindi lang sa simbahan na mag-volunteer ang iba nating senior citizens. Meron pa ring, marami pa ring volunteering opportunities sa iba't ibang sektor. School-based organizations, NGOs, and corporate groups to volunteer in government projects. So if you have attended the forum on public sector volunteerism, we have heard the COA's platform of engaging citizens in their audit. So this is part of the local volunteerism efforts. Next slide, please. Okay, and I mentioned about civil service number 23, series of 2012, and the objective here is for government agencies to establish and implement volunteer programs, promote the value of volunteerism in the public sector. When we were discussing this with some agencies, sabi nila, oo nga naman, kasi minsan ang konsepto natin ay, sabi natin, being employed in the government is already volunteering act, no? Kasi mababa daw ang sahod natin. Pero sabi rin ng isang kasamahan natin sa Career Executive Board, parang mas kailangan natin i-promote yan. Kasi minsan binigay mo na nga yung kaliwa, gusto pang kunin yung kanan. So and nasan yung volunteerism natin as government employees, no? And of course, learning experience for government employees, this gives them the chance to be further involved in development work through volunteering. Marami kasing misconceptions on volunteering, no? Or I should say stereotyping. When I was about to transfer to PNV SCA, I have a colleague from a statistician, sabi niya, director din, paano ako mag-volunteer? Gusto ko yan, yung community work and etc. But nakakalimutan natin na in volunteerism, sabi natin, this is giving your time, talent, and treasure, no? So yung unang-una siguro is our talent or our skills. So marami namang pangangailangan sa barangay, yung mga pag-ayos ng kanilang statistics, for example, that's volunteering work. So siguro these are some of the misconceptions that we hope agencies like DepEd would help us correct so that we'll be able to increase volunteering opportunities. Next slide, please. Okay, and international volunteer service, just a quick overview of this. Next slide, please. So we have this international volunteer service purposely to achieve cultural sharing and understanding. And of course, this serves as our way for service learning. And our main framework is that sana our international volunteer service would help yung community development. No? So most of the projects are really in the communities, and that they should benefit the marginalized and disadvantaged. No? Kasi yung mga ibang services, ibang volunteering efforts, baka pwede naman matugunan ito ng ating local volunteer efforts. So ito ay priority lang naman, so that if you would note yung deployment ng ating foreign volunteers, most of them are really in the marginalized sector. Next, please. So I think I already discussed the roles of PNVSCA by discussing our mandate. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So so medyo na isingit pala yung slide na yun, ano? We are discussing international volunteerism. So this is the way we deploy foreign volunteers. Usually there's an indicative planning and programming. Like for example, for COICA, they do this and they engage the stakeholders, DepEd and others for the planning and programming. They also do site identification, saan ba yung specific areas natin for the international volunteers to do their volunteering work. And we also assess ano ba yung maiaambag nitong ating volunteers. Because ayaw din naman natin na merong situation na parang nang istorbo lang yung ating mga volunteers, or parang added lang na pagahe yung ating volunteers. So we want their work, volunteering efforts to be relevant. And kaya mahalaga din yung matching, no? We match the volunteering effort as well as the need, and then we give the clearance, we process, and of course when they are here in the country, we do orientation and training, so that they will be able to understand that Filipino culture and some of the do a review whether the volunteers are able to achieve the purpose for their deployment. So next, please. Okay, so I think that's the end of my presentation. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity for PNVSCA to share what we are doing. And again, we hope for a strong naman Ma'am Ballesteros, di ba? Ang collaboration natin. Pero hopefully not only here at the central office, but if we can also go down at the field level. Muli po, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat.
Thank you very much, Director Gawe, for sharing with us and introducing to us what PNVSCA is. And I know a lot of our viewers are excited to be a volunteer and to make a difference. So what are you waiting for? Be a volunteer. Okay, on to our next speaker for today. Let me just read her bio. Okay, our next speaker, Ms. Rowena Bernal, is the Program Manager for Education of the U.S. Peace Corps Philippines Office. And Ms. Bernal has a Master's in Public Affairs degree from University of the Philippines in Las Bañas, a graduate diploma in Environmental and Natural Resources from the UP Open University, and a Bachelor in Secondary Education degree from UP Diliman. She has worked with different local and international organizations in the Philippines in the areas of development, education, health promotion and communication, child protection, and environmental protection. She also worked for several years as a teacher in the Philippines and for some time in Thailand, and has taught subjects such as social studies, politics and government, Philippine history, world history, and geography. She recently published a book titled My ABCD of I Know Me, The Alphabet of Inspiration and Motivation. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Miss Rena Bernal. Good morning, Miss Wen.
Good morning. Thank you, Jeannie. Good morning, Yusek Jess Mateo, PNV. VSA Director Donald Gawe, ICO Director 1961 by former US President John F. Kennedy. And it was actually one of his first acts when he became a president. And it was an idea that came about while he was still campaigning as a president. And since 1961, more than 240,000 Americans have served in 142 countries all over the world. Next slide. So the Philippines is one of the first countries where Peace Corps volunteers serve. As early as October 31, 1961, there was already an agreement between the Philippines and the US government for the placement of Peace Corps volunteers in the Philippines. The photo that you will see there was a screenshot of the agreement between the Philippines and the United States. And since 1961, almost 9,000 Peace Corps volunteers have served in the Philippines. Next slide, please. The Peace Corps mission is that of world peace and friendship. And it is through this mission that volunteers work towards and they are fulfilled through the 3 goals of Peace Corps. Next slide, please. So these are the 3 goals of Peace Corps, and all volunteers work towards these goals. The first one is to help the people of interested countries in meeting their needs for trained men and women. Our Peace Corps volunteers have their core expectations when they serve in the Philippines or in any country, and that is to commit to improving the quality of life of the people with whom they live and work, and in doing so, share their skills, adapt them, and learn new skills as needed. So we're highlighting here the mutual learning between the volunteer and the communities that they serve. Schools and communities learn from the Peace Corps volunteers, and we call them PCVs, and the Peace Corps volunteers learn from them too, as they have different experiences, skill set, and perspective in life. And then the second goal is to promote a better understanding of Americans on the part of the people that they serve. So again, for the expectations from the Peace Corps volunteers, they have to recognize that they will be perceived in their host country, like the Philippines, and in their communities as representative of the people, culture, values, and tradition of the United States. So it is a part of their job to help their communities better understand the American culture. And then goal 3 is the other side of goal 2, which is to promote a better understanding of other people on the part of the Americans. So they have to represent the people, the culture, values, and tradition of their host country and community to the people in the United States, both during and following their service. So being a Peace Corps volunteer does not really end for them, because even after their service, they have to represent the culture of the country where they serve. And that is the holistic approach of Peace Corps. If you will look at goal 2 and goal 3, they focus on cultural integration. So their work is as important as their cultural integration. It's the holistic approach. Next slide, please. So these are pictures of some of our volunteers living with their host families. They forge lasting friendships with their families, and they have second families in the Philippines, integrating well into the Filipino culture, including our food, the family structure, and everything that is celebrated in the community. Next slide, please. So Peace Corps Philippines has all these 4 programs. The first 3 programs are our regular programs: education, coastal resource management, and children, youth, and family. When we say regular program, that means our volunteers spend 27 months in the Philippines. The first 3 months for their training, technical training and cultural integration, and the next 24 months to serve in their permanent sites as volunteers. And then the response volunteers are short-term volunteers who are more specialized, and they stay in the Philippines for 7 months to 1 year. The placement of our Peace Corps volunteers are from Region 1 to Region 8, including the Cordillera Autonomous Region. I will be talking a little bit about each of the regular programs of Peace Corps and more on the education sector. Next slide, please. So in the coastal resource management, the volunteers work closely with the local government units, both at the municipal and the provincial levels. Next slide, please. Our volunteers are assigned usually at the Municipal Agriculture Office, or the MAO, and the Municipal Environment and Natural Resources Office, or the MENRO, or at the provincial offices, and the local government work closely with fisheries technician, or equivalent to conceptualize, plan, implement, and monitor various projects or activities. They work closely with their counterparts in these offices, and they usually come up with projects that they implement together with their counterparts. Next slide, please. You can see on the slide some specific roles that the CRM volunteers work on. They are co-trainer and co-facilitator with LGU or community counterparts. We would like to highlight that all our volunteers work with Filipino counterparts. So the CRM volunteers provide technical assistance on ecosystem assessment, MPA establishment, mangrove management, and livelihood. They also work on community organizing, focusing on socio-economic profiling, organizational strengthening of people's organizations, bantay dagat, and community consultation. They also work closely with education volunteers in doing environmental education for school-based students and out-of-school youth and adults. They also work on advocacy and grant writing and project implementation. So that's a lot of area where the coastal resource management volunteers work on. Next slide, please. This is for the next regular project of Peace Corps, the Children, Youth, and Family, or we call them the CYF. The CYF volunteers work with DSWD, the non-government organizations, and schools run by NGOs or organizations that cater to children and youth at risk. Next slide, please. So these are the specific areas of assignment for our volunteers under the Children, Youth, and Family. They work with the DSWD offices where they have the 4Ps, or the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program. They work in universities with expanded students grants in aid program for poverty alleviation. And they also work in community-based non-government organizations and center-based non-government organizations. Next slide, please. The specific roles of our volunteers when they work with their partners are to conduct YDS, or the Youth and Development Sessions, and FDS, or the Family Development Sessions. They do grassroots advocacy with their counterpart, care of children in need of special protection and victims of abuse. They also do tutoring and catch-up classes, and they focus on strengthening the life skills in the communities that they serve. Next slide, please. The third 2-year project of Peace Corps is the education project. And this is the longest running project of Peace Corps Philippines. And this is also the most common PC program globally. Next slide, please. For our Peace Corps volunteers, our area of assignment are public elementary schools and public high schools, both in the junior high school and senior high school. So we are guided by the MOU, or the Memorandum of Understanding, and the Philippine National Volunteer Service Coordinating Agency. Every 5 years, we renew the MOU with DepEd and PNVSCA, which is a good practice because we get the chance to update whatever needs to be updated in the roles and responsibilities of the volunteer and in the partnership. So the photo on the right side is a screenshot of the Memorandum of Understanding, the latest one signed in 2018. And then the photo on the lower left side was taken during the signing of the MOU in 2018. So there's Director Ballesteros, the Peace Corps Country Director Monica Collier, that's me, Secretary Briones, former PNVSA Director De Vera, and then standing at the back are Yusek Dino and Asek Absede. So the MOU is the overall guide that we use when we place volunteers in schools. It details the roles and responsibilities between Peace Corps, PNVSA, and the Department of Education from the central office, region, division office, and up to the school level. It also identifies the roles and responsibilities of the volunteer, the supervisor in the school, which is the principal, and the counterpart Filipino teacher. Next slide, please. So these are the specific roles that our volunteers in the education sector do. They co-plan and co-teach with Filipino counterparts. Again, if you notice from CRM, CYF until the education volunteer, there's always coordination, co-planning, co-facilitating, co-teaching with Filipino counterparts. This is in line with our goal 1, which is there's mutual learning between the volunteer and the community. So by working together cooperatively with the Filipino counterparts, we are also moving towards sustainability. So the other role that they do is to organize and facilitate events and activities to create opportunities for practicing and improving English language skills. So this is actually the focus of the education volunteers. And then they also work with school officials and teachers to improve or develop library resources. And they organize activities that involve the community in student learning. Next slide, please. So in this next slide, these are the specific things that they do in their role as education volunteers. So when we say co-teaching, they can be co-teaching in different subjects, such as English, science, math, literature, or any other subject as long as a volunteer is equipped to do so. For example, we had a volunteer who was a retired accountant, and she was able to teach bookkeeping to grades 11 and 12 students. So our volunteers are diverse, and they come in with different sets of skill, and so they get to teach different subjects on top of teaching English. Then they also do co-coaching of journalism, sports, and clubs such as writing club, English club, reading club, and all the other clubs that they have in the school. Many of our volunteers do remedial reading, which was really helpful for the schools, as reading is one of the areas that most schools really wanted to focus on. And then they also do library development. And with library development, they also develop student librarians. And so that allows for students to participate in taking care of their library. And then they do language camps, and then environmental camps. And this is where they work with other volunteers from Peace Corps. And they have school-specific projects. For example, there were schools who have agricultural lab classes. And so the volunteers implement projects such as agricultural laboratory. Our volunteers do not come with funds, but they, together with the counterpart, they write grant proposals so that they would receive grant for projects like this. Next slide, please. These are some of the photos of our volunteers at work. The first 2 photos on top are photos of our volunteer in Siquijor, and the last, she was teaching in a high school, and the last 2 photos are volunteers in Camarines Sur. Next slide, please. And these are photos of the library that the volunteers together with their counterparts developed. You can see the happiness in for the teacher and the students to use the library for the first time. It's really heartwarming to see them. And the teachers and the students really participated in the implementation of the library projects. So they were more involved, and they really appreciated the participatory process of the project implementation. And then next slide, please. So during this pandemic, the volunteers were evacuated globally, And it was a quick evacuation for us in the Philippines in March as we rushed before the flights, all local and international, were canceled. However, the work for Peace Corps continues. And recently, we partnered with DepEd, ICO, and BLD through the BLD-TLD multi-grade team through a workshop to develop learning activity sheets through a grant from USAID in support of DepEd's learning continuity plan. So right now, we have 85 learning activity sheets for the third quarter and another 85 learning activity sheets for the fourth quarter. And they are all in the process of quality assurance to be distributed before the third and the fourth quarters. Next slide, please. We also continue the supportive communication with our former work partners. For example, during the World Teachers' Day, we understand how difficult it has been for the teachers and how difficult it was for them to balance work and family and to stay safe while also thinking of the safety of their students and the community. And so Peace Corps staff wrote letters and sent those letters to our teachers. And those letters came with books that they can use for their school and their classes. And the books came from the US Embassy's Regional English Language Office. Next slide, please. So we also continued the volunteer-led write-on competition, which was an international competition on creative writing. And then right now, we are continuously working on the re-entry of volunteers in the Philippines, of course, taking into consideration the safety of volunteers and host schools and the community. So we would like to come back. The volunteers would like to come back. We would like to work with them. But we also want to make sure that everyone would be safe, and it would be safe to do so. And we also conduct continued coordination with possible sites for the reentry of volunteers. Actually, last December 11, we had a meeting with all the prospective schools when the volunteers returned to the Philippines. And even our volunteers continue their communication with their host country agencies, especially with their host families. And they also do volunteer work in their own communities in the US. So those three, CRM, CYF, and the education sectors are the three projects of Peace Corps Philippines, the regular projects of Peace Corps Philippines. And the last one, next slide, please, is the Peace Corps Response Volunteers, where they, like I said, they stay here for 7 months to 1 year, and they're usually placed in LGUs, offices, and universities. And their area of work usually is very specialized. They focus on disaster preparedness, youth development, organizational